Paul Henderson didn't know the exact moment when the raven started following him. Maybe it was at his wife's funeral, when he saw that black bird perched on the chapel roof, its eyes fixed on him as the coffin was lowered into the ground. Or maybe it was before that, when he could still hear Karen's weakened breathing in the empty nights, knowing the end was near. But now, a year later, there was no more doubt. The raven knew. It knew the secrets, the broken promises, and above all, the guilt Paul carried like an anchor around his neck. Deep down, Paul had always known the bird wasn't there by chance. It looked at him in a different way. It was as if those dark eyes could see every fragment of his shattered soul, every dark thought he had never dared to share. Wherever he went, there it was, perched in some corner, watching, waiting. And with every passing night, the raven's gaze became more penetrating, more human. Paul didn't know what was worse, being watched by that bird or by the torturous memory of his wife, because sometimes he thought they were the same thing. The clock read 6 a.m., but Paul had been awake for hours, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of the silent house. The emptiness was almost tangible, filled only by the distant sound of wind blowing through the trees in the forest surrounding Cedar Grove. Since Karen's death, mornings had become a battle. Getting out of bed was an act of strength. Living was an arduous task. He finally got up, feeling the weight of years and grief in every movement. The bathroom mirror reflected a man he barely recognized, unshaven, with deep, red-rimmed eyes. He looked like someone who had spent too many sleepless nights, which was in fact true. The memories of Karen haunted him, the last weeks at the hospital, the conversations they never had, the regrets he never voiced. Throwing on a wrinkled shirt, he left for work. Tom's auto shop was just a few minutes away by car, a short, quiet drive through the calm, tree-lined streets. But that morning, while driving, a movement caught his eye. The raven was there again, perched on the wooden fence of a neighboring house, watching him. Its dark eyes glinted in the pale morning light, reflecting something Paul couldn't quite place. He felt a chill down his spine but kept driving, trying to ignore the unease. It was just a bird, he told himself. Just a raven, but this wasn't the first time he'd seen it. In fact, he was starting to realize the raven was always there. It had been in the same spot yesterday, and the day before, always watching, always waiting. The shop was empty when he arrived. Tom hadn't gotten there yet, which was unusual. Paul parked the car and walked inside, the familiar scent of grease and old metal immediately grounding him. In a way, the mechanical routine of fixing cars was one of the few things that still gave him a sense of control. At least there, in the world of gears and engines, things made sense. They could be fixed. He opened the garage and began setting up the tools for the day, diving into work as a way to escape his thoughts. But even as he focused, he couldn't shake the strange feeling of being watched. He looked around, suspicious, but there was no one. Then something caught his attention in the corner of the yard. The raven, perched on a toolbox outside. Paul froze for a moment, his jaw tightening. The bird was there again, too close, watching him intently as if it knew something he didn't. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed a wrench and walked out into the yard, trying to scare the raven away, but as he approached, the bird didn't move. It just stared at him. Its dark eyes followed him like two bottomless pits filled with an unsettling knowledge. "Go away," Paul shouted, his voice echoing in the empty space. He waved the wrench in the air, expecting the raven to fly off, but the bird didn't budge. For a moment, Paul thought he was losing his mind. He looked closer at the bird, which now stared at him in a way no animal should be capable of. It was a human gaze, deep and somehow accusatory, as if the raven knew what Paul had done or what he hadn't done. Finally, the bird spread its wings and flew off, disappearing into the dense forest beyond the shop. Paul felt a cold shiver run through his body, as if something had just passed through him, leaving a trail of ice. Trying to gather himself, he walked back inside, but the discomfort lingered. The raven, something was wrong with that bird, he knew. It knew the secrets Paul had buried, the guilt he couldn't shake, and somehow, the raven seemed to be waiting for something Paul couldn't understand just yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Tom arrived later, and they exchanged a few words about work, but Paul couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to the raven, to those piercing eyes he couldn't forget. That night, when Paul returned home, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. And when he looked out the bedroom window, there it was again, the raven perched on the nearest tree, its eyes glowing in the darkness. Paul threw himself onto the bed that night, his body heavy, the physical exhaustion trying in vain to compensate for the emotional weight he carried. The muffled sound of the forest surrounding his house used to calm him, but that night it seemed to amplify his restlessness. He closed his eyes, but just like the past few weeks, sleep came slowly, wrapped in shadows. When he finally drifted off, the nightmares didn't take long to begin. Paul found himself back at the hospital, the smell of disinfectant and illness filling the air. Karen was there, lying in bed, pale, fragile, each breath a monumental effort. He tried to speak to her, but his mouth produced no sound. She slowly turned her head toward him, and when their eyes met, Paul froze. Karen's eyes, they were no longer hers. They were dark, empty, as deep as two black holes. The same eyes as the raven. He tried to scream, but only a strangled sound escaped his throat. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was a rough, distorted whisper. "You let me go. Why didn't you do anything?" Paul woke with a jolt, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. His hand instinctively went to his neck, where he could still feel the suffocating weight of the nightmare. He looked around the room, trying to calm himself. The darkness felt thicker than usual, and for a moment he thought he saw something move by the window. Slowly he got up and walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside. Outside, the moonlight cast strange shadows over the forest. Paul scanned the yard, trying to shake off the growing paranoia. But he knew what he was looking for, what he expected to see. The raven wasn't there. He exhaled, trying to convince himself that it had all just been a dream, just the stress of so many sleepless nights. But as he walked back to bed, a silent dread remained with him, like a shadow in the corner of the room. The next morning, the image of Karen's eyes was still etched in his mind. He could barely eat before leaving for work, the feeling of unease growing with every step. On the way to the shop, he passed by familiar houses, lined with wooden fences and old trees that bordered the streets of Cedar Grove. Everything seemed normal, but Paul felt as if a hidden layer of darkness was crawling behind the town's peaceful facade. As soon as he arrived at the shop, the sensation of being watched returned with full force. He was used to being there alone in the mornings, waiting for Tom to arrive. But that day something felt different. He sensed a presence. Paul looked around, trying to ignore the feeling, but the thought persisted, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. And then as he started organizing his tools, he saw it. The raven was back, perched in the same spot as the day before, on top of a toolbox near the entrance. Its black eyes gleamed, fixed on Paul, as if it were studying him, dissecting his thoughts. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. It was just a bird. A damn bird. He tried to rationalize it, but something deep in his mind screamed otherwise. What did that bird want? Why did it keep coming back? Paul brushed the thoughts aside and tried to focus on work, but it was impossible. Every time he glanced sideways, the raven was there watching. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, it just stared with that unblinking gaze. When Tom finally arrived at the shop, Paul felt a fleeting sense of relief. The presence of another person brought a strange comfort, as if it could somehow dispel the weight of that piercing stare. Tom walked in, greeting Paul with a nod, but soon noticed the state his friend was in. "You all right, Paul? You look like you haven't slept at all." Paul hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He knew talking about the raven would sound ridiculous. It was just a bird, right? But the nightmares, the eyes, something was seriously wrong, and he couldn't understand why. Just a bad night," he finally said, trying to downplay the situation. Tom shrugged and went off to work on a car, but Paul noticed that he cast curious glances his way from time to time, as if sensing there was more going on. The raven, however, didn't leave. It stayed there all day, motionless except for the occasional flap of its wings, and every time Paul looked at it, he felt as though the bird was laughing at him on the inside, as if it knew something Paul didn't. That night promised to be long. When Paul returned home, he felt like a shadow of himself. The physical and mental exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders, and all he wanted was to rest. But the fear of dreaming, of seeing Karen's eyes again, that terrified him. Little did he know that night's nightmares would be even more terrifying. The night was cruel to Paul. He tossed and turned in bed, waiting for sleep that never seemed to come. The exhaustion had built up to the point where his muscles ached, but his thoughts were too restless to allow any real rest. When he finally drifted off, It was like falling straight into an abyss of shadows, and at the bottom of that abyss were her eyes. Paul was back at the house. Not the one he lived in now, but the old one where he and Karen had spent their last years together. The place was quiet, the lights dim. He felt a presence there, something invisible but undeniably present. Suddenly he heard a soft sound, like dragging footsteps in the hallway. He followed the sound to the bedroom. When he opened the door, he found Karen standing there facing away from him, her long brown hair covering her shoulders. For a moment everything seemed normal, almost comforting. But then she slowly turned around and Paul felt his blood turn to ice. Her eyes were wrong. They weren't Karen's eyes, those warm, loving eyes he knew so well. They were two dark, shining holes, the same piercing eyes as the raven. The sight made him recoil, but his legs felt glued to the floor. Karen took a step toward him, and when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice came out distorted, an inhuman, bitter whisper. "You left me, Paul. Why didn't you save me?" The guilt hit him like a relentless wave. He tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but his mouth was dry, unable to form any words. Karen took another step, and now he could feel her icy breath. She was too close. Her skeletal fingers touched his arm, and Paul's skin burned as if it were being scorched. He woke up with a strangled cry, his body trembling and drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. Paul breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling uncontrollably. He rubbed his face with his hands, trying to calm down, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him. He looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Time seemed to have stopped, as if he were trapped in a continuous nightmare, where the horror didn't end when he woke up. He needed to get up, needed to move. He stood and walked to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. When he looked up at the mirror, his eyes found something that made him stagger back. Karen was there in the reflection. Paul fell back, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked and the vision vanished, leaving only his pale, exhausted face in the mirror. But the fear lingered. That hadn't been a dream. He had seen her, in the mirror. He went back to the bedroom and, with trembling hands, closed the curtains blocking out the moonlight. He needed to feel safe, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. He didn't know if it was the raven or his own mind betraying him, but the line between reality and nightmare was starting to blur. The next day, the exhaustion was nearly unbearable. He arrived at the shop later than usual, his body worn out, his nerves on edge. Tom was already there, preparing for the day's work, but when he looked at Paul, his face twisted with concern. "You look awful, man. Did you get any sleep?" Tom asked as he tightened bolts under a car. Paul shook his head, unsure of what to say. He was at his breaking point, his mind a mess. The visions, the nightmares, and the raven. Always the raven. It's just nightmares. And there's this damn raven that seems to follow me everywhere, he finally confessed, hoping that saying the words out loud would ease the weight on his shoulders. Tom laughed, thinking Paul was joking. "A raven? Seriously? Maybe you need a vacation, man. You're burning yourself out here." Paul tried to smile, but everything inside him was falling apart. He knew that what he was feeling wasn't normal. He knew something was wrong, something beyond exhaustion. He wasn't just tired. He was being haunted. Hunted. And now even Karen was back, or something that looked like her. All day, he felt the raven's gaze even without seeing it. It was as if it were lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to appear. When night came and Paul returned home, he dreaded what was to come. That night he decided not to sleep. He sat on the couch with the lights on, a bottle of whiskey beside him. The sound of the forest outside, once so calming, now made him shudder. Every branch that swayed in the wind seemed to hide the raven. Around 3 in the morning, when his eyes were about to close, he heard a sound, a soft tapping coming from the window. Paul's heart nearly stopped. He turned slowly, his stomach twisting in fear. The raven was there, perched on the windowsill, its eyes glowing in the dark. The same eyes he had seen in his dreams, in the mirrors, in his nightmares. The raven tilted its head to the side as if studying him. Paul's breath caught in his throat. The bird wasn't just a bird, it was something much worse. Paul stared at the raven at the window, the bird's eyes like black mirrors reflecting his deepest fears. He felt a strange mixture of terror and fascination as he watched the animal, silent, unmoving. It was as if time had frozen. The wind outside had stopped blowing, and even the house seemed to be holding its breath. The raven watched him with a terrible patience, as if it were waiting for the right moment to take the next step. Paul knew that something had changed. It wasn't just a coincidence that the bird was there. as if it knew his resistance was wearing thin. He needed to leave, he needed to escape the house, the forest, that suffocating presence. But when he tried to get up from the couch, his legs trembled. He was weak, both physically and emotionally. The raven tilted its head to the side, a subtle but disturbing gesture as if it were assessing its prey. Paul forced himself to walk to the front door. His body moving mechanically, he grabbed the doorknob but hesitated. Part of him knew that running wouldn't change anything. The raven would follow, just like the nightmares, the hallucinations, and the guilt. Running felt pointless. He glanced back at the window. The raven was still there, but now its gaze was different. There was an expectation. The bird knew he was about to give up. Finally, Paul let go of the doorknob and collapsed onto the floor of the living room, his hands trembling. He felt defeated, as if the weight of the last few months had crushed him all at once. His mind refused to find answers, and more he wondered if he was going insane. It was in that state of despair that he heard a knock at the door. Paul's head shot up, his heart racing. Who would be here at this hour? He walked hesitantly to the door and opened it slowly, almost dreading what he might find. Tom stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise at the sight of Paul. "Paul? Man, what's going on with you?" Tom looked at him like he was seeing a ghost. "You didn't show up at work today, and when I called, you didn't answer. I thought I'd better come check on you." Paul felt a brief sense of relief at seeing a familiar face, but Tom's presence didn't dispel the feeling of being watched. He looked back at the window. The raven was gone, as if it had never been there. But Paul knew that wasn't real relief. The bird was just waiting, hidden in the shadows. I'm not okay, Tom." The words came out with difficulty. Paul was exhausted, worn down to the limit. He knew he needed to talk to someone, needed help. But how could he explain what had been happening? How could he tell Tom about the raven, the nightmares, the visions of Karen? Tom would never understand. No one would. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Tom said, concerned. He stepped into the house without being invited, scanning the dark and disordered room. "What the hell happened to you? Something's wrong." Paul shook his head, feeling a lump form in his throat. He needed to tell the truth, but the words were trapped, suffocated by the fear of sounding crazy. "It's the raven, Tom," Paul muttered, finally breaking the silence. "There's a raven that's been following me. It's not normal, it knows, and it watches me." Tom blinked, stunned. For a moment, Paul was sure Tom was going to laugh or tell him to see a psychiatrist. But to his surprise, Tom just frowned, looking genuinely worried. "A raven? What do you mean? A bird, Paul? You're telling me a bird is scaring you?" The disbelief in Tom's voice was obvious, but he was still there, which in some way made Paul feel a little less isolated, even if just for a moment. Paul's throat felt dry. He knew how ridiculous it sounded, and his own mind was tired of trying to rationalize what was happening. But the truth was far more terrifying than just a raven. The bird was tied to something much deeper, something he couldn't name. "It's not just that, it's like it knows something. It shows up when I think about Karen." The mention of his wife's name brought back all the buried pain. He choked on the words, guilt and grief rising up in full force. Tom looked at him, unsure of how to respond. The silence between them was suffocating until Paul finally collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I see her, Tom. Karen, in my dreams and mirrors. And her eyes aren't hers. They're the raven's eyes." Tom stood there for a long moment, not knowing what to say. He could see the desperation in Paul, but this was beyond anything he could comprehend. The house was steeped in a strange energy, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with anguish and sorrow. Tom's discomfort grew with each passing second, but he couldn't just leave his friend in this state. "Maybe you just need some rest, Paul, a good night's sleep, you know." Tom took a step toward the door, hesitating. "Maybe it's the exhaustion. Things like that can mess with your head." Paul shook his head, laughing bitterly. "You don't understand, Tom. It's not exhaustion, it's not just in my head. It's pulling me under every day worse, every time deeper. I don't know what to say, Paul, but if you need help, real help, you know where to find me, okay?" Tom left soon after, leaving Paul alone once again, the echo of his words lingering in the empty house. But Paul knew that what was happening was much more than just exhaustion. It was something far deeper. He was being consumed. And the raven knew that. When Paul returned to the living room, he sank into the couch, his shoulders slumped, feeling the weight of the world on his back. The raven was gone for now, but he knew it was only temporary. It would be back. It always came back. Hours passed and night fell over the house like a suffocating veil. Physical exhaustion finally took over, and Paul fell asleep on the couch. But rest didn't come. In the middle of the night, he awoke to a sound. A whisper. He opened his eyes slowly, his heart pounding. The room was dark, but he could feel something there. Something familiar. "Paul?" It was Karen's voice. "Paul." Karen's voice echoed in the silence of the room, soft but with a weight that made his heart race with both fear and hope. Paul froze on the couch, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He didn't want to believe what he was hearing, but deep down he knew he wasn't dreaming. Something was there with him. Slowly he stood up, his muscles stiff with tension. The room seemed darker than it should be, and the air around him felt thick, almost as if it were hard to breathe. Paul felt like he was sinking into a dense fog, a fog of fear and guilt that suffocated him. "Karen?" His voice came out weak, hesitant. He didn't want to believe this was happening again, but there she was. The presence he felt, the icy sensation of being watched. It was undeniable. And then she appeared. Karen stood there at the doorway to the bedroom, but something was wrong. Her body looked distorted, like a shadow cast at strange angles. Her face, the same face he had loved, was there, but her eyes, those eyes, the same dark, empty eyes, the eyes of the raven. Paul's stomach churned. "Why did you leave me, Paul?" Her voice came out in a whisper, but there was pain in it, pain and anger. He shook his head, stepping back. I didn't leave you. I tried, I did everything I could." But the words felt hollow. The guilt had always been there, eating away at him. He knew that no matter how much he had done, it would never have been enough. He hadn't been able to save her. And now that feeling of helplessness was taking shape in front of him. In the distorted figure of Karen. "You could have done more," the figure said, taking a step toward him. "You abandoned me. You knew what was happening, and still you let me go." Paul dropped to his knees, his hands shaking. He didn't know what was real or what was a product of his fractured mind, but somehow he knew the raven was behind this. He could feel its presence, its shadow looming over everything. The air around him shifted, and Paul felt a wave of cold sweep over his skin. When he looked at the window, the raven was there, its wings spread, its eyes glowing in the darkness like beacons of despair. The bird wasn't just an external manifestation. It was the reflection of Paul's own pain, his guilt. The raven was tied to him in a way Paul couldn't explain, but now he understood that he couldn't run. It was time to confront it. Breathing heavily, Paul stood, his knees trembling. He faced the figure of Karen, now more distorted and menacing, and shouted, "I'm not guilty. I tried everything, but you're gone. It wasn't my fault." As he said it, something shifted. The figure of Karen began to dissolve like smoke being blown away by the wind. Her eyes glowed one last time before she disappeared completely. Paul turned toward the window. The raven was still there, but its eyes no longer glowed. For a moment he thought the bird might attack, but then it spread its wings and silently flew away, vanishing into the night. And for the first time in months, Paul breathed a sigh of relief. The raven was gone, but the silence it left behind was heavy. Filled with memories, Paul knew the emotional scars would still remain. But in that moment, he finally felt like he could breathe again, even if the emptiness left by Karen's loss would never be filled. Yet as he stepped away from the window, something inside him whispered that it wasn't truly over. Maybe somewhere, the raven was waiting to return. The weeks that followed that night were strange but quiet. Paul returned to the shop, returned to a routine. The nights were no longer plagued by nightmares, and although there was still a lingering shadow of sadness, the crushing weight of guilt finally seemed to have loosened enough for him to breathe. Tom watched him closely, still a little suspicious about what had happened, but didn't press the matter. Paul hadn't mentioned the raven anymore, and that was enough for Tom to think that maybe things were going back to normal. But deep down, Paul knew something had changed forever. The emptiness left by Karen's passing still followed him, like an emotional scar that would never fully disappear. He tried to fill the silence with work and distractions, but from time to time his thoughts wandered back to that night. The night he saw something impossible, something he still couldn't fully explain. Yet no matter how much he tried to move on, Paul never forgot. And on some nights as he lay in bed, he would hear the wind blowing outside and wonder if, maybe, the raven was still out there, just waiting. One night, weeks after the raven's disappearance, Paul was leaving the shop late. the sky already darkening. He locked the door and looked out at the line of trees surrounding the place. Everything seemed calm, silent. Then he heard it. A single caw. The sound echoed through the night, low, distant, but unmistakable. Paul froze, his eyes fixed on the darkness of the forest. He didn't see anything, but he knew. He knew the raven was back. Paul took a deep breath, but this time he didn't turn to run. Instead, he stood there, his eyes locked on the tree line, waiting. Because deep down he had always known the raven had never really left. And now it was back.